Paula today. And yeah, Ana Paula, the stage is for you. Welcome. Thank you so much for accepting to do this second part of this webinar. And yeah, take it from here.
Thank you so much, Agueda. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for taking this time today to be with us and explore how to provide better services to individuals who don't feel fully comfortable in English. And we'll be talking about some strategies in working with interpreters. So before we begin, I would like to ask everybody who's present and who has access to a computer to please write on the chat box your name, your organization, and perhaps where you are located, your title or the role that you play in your organization, and just maybe one word that reflects an expectation that you might have for today's webinar. So I will give a couple of minutes for people to start chatting along, and I'll write it here, your name. And so for those people who don't know where the chat is, it's right underneath the panel control of the webinar. Okay. So I hope you can see my message. And that's exactly in the chat where you can write your name, organization, your title, and one expectation. Sometimes people are joining over the phone, so I'm just going to give another minute, and if I don't see any responses, I will continue so we can really get into the nitty-gritty of this presentation. And for those who are just joining, if you can please introduce yourselves on the chat box. If you can please write your name, your organization, and where you are located, your title, and one expectation for this webinar.
Ana Paula, as right now we have 85% of the our victim advocates. We have 15% who are work with the government agency, 7% who said other, and hopefully they will describe what that is. We don't have any lawyers or anything like that. So keep pulling the poll. We will share it in 1 second.
Great.
We have closed the poll at this time. Again, we have 75% as advocates, 19% of government agencies, and 6% who have said other. So
other, great, perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Agueda. So let's keep moving. So I see that many of you are victims advocates, and perhaps the topic that we're talking about today resonates a lot in terms of whether you are a bilingual victim advocate and whether or not you have engaged yourself in hiring interpreters or yourself have been interpreting. So just very quickly, and for those who participated in last week's webinar, you probably heard a little bit more about us. So the Interpretation Technical Assistance Resource Center is part of the Asian Pacific Institute on Gender-Based Violence. And basically, we are a comprehensive technical assistance provider of the Office of Violence Against Women. And we serve federal grantees as part of our work. We are located mostly in the West Coast. So we have our main office in Oakland, and there is a staff in Washington, and also myself, I am in Los Angeles. And we are funded to provide technical assistance on language access planning. So we made this announcement last week. If you are thinking on developing a language access plan, if you are working with interpreters and you need support, please reach out. You will find my information at the end of the webinar. And just to share, we offer trainings on language access for staff really based on their specific needs, and we support them in developing protocols and promising practices that impact their organizations. We also do trainings for bilingual staff bilingual individuals to enhance their interpretation skills and learn ethical considerations of the interpretation profession. We have actually been working with 2 consultants for a long time who are certified interpreters, and they have developed, support us in developing and facilitating trainings that are geared to people who are certified interpreters on how to interpret for domestic violence and sexual assault. We have also trained and continue training law enforcement so that bilingual officers can be a resource for the community and really know the protocols when asked to interpret. We also do a lot of work around policy to make sure that all the systems that victims encounter are upheld to federal guidelines to provide language access. So we work with child welfare systems, with courts, et cetera, And I joined ITARC last February 2018, and I bring a very strong background on language justice advocacy that we are at this point exploring on how to incorporate into our work within ITARC, and really start thinking about how to create spaces that are really fully available to everyone, where every person can bring themselves and their full identity, speaking in the language that they feel most articulate, most powerful, most comfortable with. And we really want to think about, so last week we talked about language access, and the language justice framework is really thinking beyond the compliance and thinking about how can we build organizations and ultimately a gender justice movement that listens and makes spaces for all voices in an intentional way, respecting everybody's identity and honoring everybody's personhood. So we are going to be touching on that. And ultimately, what we really want to do is to increase leadership development in our movement and have a diverse movement that reflects the reality of the United States, which is a multicultural, multilingual, big community. So with that said, I want to go over our learning objectives for today. So we will be doing quick exercises to recognize language barriers that are experienced by limited English proficient and deaf and hard of hearing individuals, especially when they're trying to access domestic violence and sexual assault services. And how can they fully participate in those settings? We will be developing awareness on how to provide timely and quality services for limited English proficient and deaf or hard of hearing individuals. And we'll be talking about how can we implement promising practices when working with interpreters. So I always like to start my webinars with some community agreements. I know it's very hard when we are joining a webinar to stay fully present. There's so many interesting windows and so many different interesting things in the internet. So I will ask for this 1.5 hours to really try to stay fully present. And in the exercise that we do, to think about on your own privileges and biases, what are you bringing to the space and to your work? We all carry those, and we all can unlearn and move away towards being more understanding and respectful of different communities and groups. Step up, step down. If you like to participate, make space for others. Challenge yourself and take care of yourself.
Hope for the best.
And with that said, I want to go over some working definitions. And this one, for those people who participated in last week's webinar, we went through these definitions. So individuals with limited English proficiency. So these are the people who are considered LEP when they speak a different language as their primary language and have a limited ability to read, write, speak, or understand English. It's very important to highlight with this definition that many of these people have a lot of abilities in speaking other, sometimes 1 or 2 languages, and just in the context of the U.S., they cannot communicate and they cannot navigate their lives in English. And when we're talking about the deaf community, when you see it with an uppercase D, it refers to a full identity. So the deaf community has its own culture, its own language, and it has within the deaf community many diverse communities, including communities that have a limited English proficiency. So this is some of the intersections that we will be talking about on how are we thinking about the services that we're providing perhaps to people who are deaf, but who might come from different countries, who might not be fluent in ASL, American Sign Language, and how are we exploring the options that we have to communicate with them based on their communication preferences. Deaf with lowercase refers to a physical condition or impairment. I already mentioned that it's part of, so in general, the deaf community does not, or hard of hearing, do not understand
absolutely.
Their inability to hear as a disability issue, but more as a language issue.
So we're finished this introduction.
And
okay.
We're going to be making reference to some of these definitions along the webinar. And let's start a little exercise. And if you have access to the chat box, that's great. If not, you can still participate. And I will, before we start thinking about in-depth of the role and how to work with interpreters, I really want to give some continuation to what we covered with Wendy and start thinking about the dynamic of language and power. So I will ask wherever you are to take a deep breath and reflect on a moment in your life when you very clearly felt the power of language. And this could be a moment where the power of language was manifested in your life in a positive way, quote unquote, where you were able to access certain things because of the language that you speak, or were you hindered to access certain thing or as certain surveys because of the language that you speak. And I will give maybe 1 minute for those people who have access to the chat box to share what experience was that. And maybe if you can share a word that describes that experience. So again, and we are not used to reflecting on this, so sometimes it's challenging to think about that. And what I'm asking the audience is to think about a moment in your life when you felt the power of language. And that power could probably have been felt as a positive experience or a negative experience. And share one word that could describe that experience. And again, I'm going to give people a chance. You can access the chat where it says chat and just press on the drop-down menu. Okay, so I don't see, I don't know if you have access. I'm not seeing a lot of activity.
Yes, so we have a couple answers: encouraging, frustration, empowerment, scary, humiliating teacher, frustration. Those are some of the things that people have put in the chat box responding to your question.
Great, thank you so much. I don't know why I cannot access those. So absolutely right. So most of us had felt that power in a, and I don't like to call it a negative way, but in a way that was not nourishing for our lives. And this comes up all the time for more than half of inhabitants in the US, right? Thinking about all the people who feel, who don't feel comfortable communicating themselves in English in a world that is mostly dominated in English, and really being able to speak in our language, to share what's going on in our language is dependent on our ability to feel safe, to feel informed, to participate. And when we don't have this ability to communicate in our languages, then we feel disempowered. So really thinking about this power of language is an analysis that helps us connect with the utilization of our voices to exercise power in our life. And I have another question for you. So in your experience working with different communities, as CASA members, you probably work with a very, very different set of communities and ethnic groups. What challenges do they encounter with respect to language?
I'll be sending a text like that.
If you can also please write down in the chat box. And Nadia, maybe if you can report back, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll wait until she responds. Okay, is she gonna do it?
So again, in your experience working with different communities, what challenges do they encounter with respect to language?
Okay, we're getting a couple answers to that. People who speaks just one language do not understand how important it is to slow down in the other to make sure that people understand what is happening. The second one that says programs unwillingly to work with someone that doesn't speak English. I have to encourage people to slow down, to work at the speed of democracy, not responding or applying for assistance due to barriers, not aware of resources, that the community offers, inability to understand the severity of lack of any situation, programs that do not do not know how to use interpreters, materials in the language, lack of interpreters, not being able to communicate or being able to be aware of what is going on in the cases. Those are some of the answers.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And you are all so right. So there is this lack of willingness to slow down. So when we're working in a setting where we have different languages, we need to slow down to be able to incorporate all the voices that are present. And I also heard a lot of lack of ability or knowledge on how to work with interpreters, and individuals not being aware ultimately of what is available to them in terms of services, and how that really creates a really high level of risk, specifically for victims, to access services. And as service providers, really, we cannot build, report, or communicate with and explaining vital services that we offer to survivors in a way that they can process and feel supported. They have experienced a lot of oppression, they have experienced a lot of trauma and distrust, and so when there is no language support, this experience amplifies. And this is the reality, as you know, for many of our clients whose preferred languages, spoken or sign, and it's very important that we highlight that. We're talking here about spoken or signed languages. They're often not provided the services that they deserve. And this is pretty much connected to the concept of language justice, right? How language is really a very deep component of our cultural identity, how our mother tongue or language helps us navigate the world. It supports us in developing a safe community, find solidarity with others. So when we create spaces where everybody can communicate, we can find that we are suffering from the same issues, the same abuse, and then it really allows us to find and develop strategies together. So our experiences, our emotions, our desires are really experienced in our first language. I can tell you, me as a Mexican woman, I am bilingual and I have the privilege to navigating the world in both languages. I can access spaces, talk to different people, I can be seen, but there's very often times where I feel fatigue of communicating in English, and sometimes English does not feel the best tool to communicate my feelings and my emotion, my thoughts and my passions. And this might have been the case for you. Now, let's think about victims, individuals who are experiencing trauma, who have been abused, whose self-esteem has been lowered to a level that they don't recognize themselves. So this experience with language is even more acute, where they really cannot feel empowered to leave the abusive situation. And this is a map that was developed by the Praxis, and it shows, I think it's a great tool to really understand all the different points of contact, places where victims are interacting with sheriff's department, with the court, with child welfare, with a 911 call, and how overwhelming it might be for them, not only having to navigate this world with trauma in a different language, but also encountering all this legal and technical slang, experiencing impatience of some employees, as you mentioned before. People don't slow down, people just don't have the patience to be able to work with people that speak different languages. And in reality, communication is everything at many different levels of engagement. What we want to do is really not only having victims be able to access and benefit from their constitutional rights to have language access and receive wonderful services from all of the organizations that you work with, but also we want to make sure that these victims have the ability to communicate and participate fully. As you know, many of the victims that receive services with many of your organizations often feel moved to provide help and become involved in the gender-based violence movement once that they are in a safe place. So we really want to create spaces where they feel welcome, where they feel that their voice is heard and honored, and where they can bring their full selves with their culture, with their fears, with their history to the space in their preferred language. So we really want to not only provide language access to these victims, make sure that they're safe, that they can access justice, but we want their voices to be leading the gender-based violence movement. And we really need to start thinking about how are we creating opportunities for people to, one, participate in their own languages, and for those people who have the privilege of speaking the dominant language, in this case English, in many other countries, for example in Mexico, the dominant language is Spanish. How can we also create awareness with people who are bilingual or who speak the dominant language to create more spaces and to share spaces with those who don't feel fully comfortable in those languages? And as you mentioned in the chat box, the reality is that the access and cross-language communication resources are scarce. Many of you might have access to trained interpreters in your organization. Some of you might have access to Language Line, and also some of you might have access to 0 interpreters. And this is a reality. So this is just different pointers of reality that many organizations experience and the challenges that arise when trying to achieve language access and language justice. So today we're going to be talking about some strategies to address these challenges and how to increase access and high quality cross-language communication with not only for the victims, but also within your staff. Many of you might feel even more comfortable speaking in a different language when you're working with your colleagues. So how can we really start honoring that and start thinking about how to create bilingual on multilingual spaces? And the thing I really like to think about what are the openings instead of thinking about what are the barriers. So really start imagining what would a timely and effective language support look like. What is that vision? How would it look for the clients? How would it look for staff where people can really go to, for example, a medical appointment and understand their diagnosis and be able to follow up their plan, or just in general, families accessing timely services and receiving equal quality of services in education, in housing. So envisioning that world and going from there, because ultimately our aim is to provide meaningful access. And when we talked about what meaningful access means, which is basically the language assistance that results in accurate, timely, and effective communication at no cost to the person who doesn't speak English or doesn't feel comfortable speaking English. And we want to make sure that the services that this person is receiving are not restricted, delayed, or inferior compared to those programs or activities that are provided to individuals who do feel comfortable, powerful, and articulate in English. So here we're talking about the floor and beyond. We really want to foster equity. We really want to achieve language justice. and making sure that these victims, survivors, their families can communicate in the language in which they feel more comfortable and be able to seek safety, wellness, and continue participating in different movements. And the reality is that we still have so much to do to foster equity and encourage full participation. In 2018, today, there are so many different contexts still where access to interpretation is not available or not used, as you mentioned, because people don't know how to use it.
We have the story
and
project.
So now moving to these strategies, I want to ask you, and if you can please write down in your chat box, so what would be some of these tools that we can, or your programs can use to provide meaningful access? How can we successfully honor, what tools can we use to successfully honor the languages and the cultures of all of these victims that come to our doors for help? So if you can please write down what tools would you use or are you using to provide meaningful access in the context of your organization?
Right. And the need for support for advocates also.
And Megan, I'll ask you to report back, please.
Yes, I will.
Great.
Hire full-time interpreter, language line, translated materials, interpreters funds, court interpreters. Let's see. Let's see what else.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great. That's absolutely great. So, as you mentioned, the most obvious and basic tools to providing meaningful access and translation are translation and interpretation. And I just want to make a clarification. Often people get confused with these two activities, and I just want to clarify that they're different. So translation is converting written text from one language into a written text of another language. And this is for example, the website of your organization, or affidavits, or restraining order forms. So translation, always writing. Interpretation refers to the process of verbally or visually rendering a spoken or signed message from one language into another. So it could be from spoken language to ASL, from ASL to spoken language, or spoken language A to spoken language B. And it requires very different skills. So translation, you have time to look online, maybe you have a dictionary, and there is a time frame that you're given to render or deliver a translation. Interpretation is usually live. It's at the moment. It's harder to access a dictionary or tools online to be able to render the message in the language that you're interpreting to. So it's very important when you are hiring services for the victims that you're working with and for your organization, it's very important that you know the difference. Because if you are writing to an agency and saying, hey, I need translation for an event, they will need more information to make sure that what you mean is a translation of a written document, or if you're requiring interpretation for a meeting or a session with your client. So for the rest of the webinar, we'll mostly spend time talking about interpretation. And I have a quick poll here. Please respond yes or no to the following questions. And the poll will pop up in your screen. So have you worked with in-person interpreters? Yes or no? Have you worked with telephonic or video remote interpreters? Yes or no? And just exploring a little bit about translation, are you in charge of requesting translation material? I'm going to give you a couple of minutes for people to respond. So 57, okay, so it's changing. So most of you have worked with in-person interpreters, 62% have worked with telephonic or video remote. Some of you, okay, so it keeps moving, but most of you have worked with in-person interpreters. Great. So I will not be spending a lot of time talking about the different modes of interpretation, but I just wanted to give you some basic information. So you have simultaneous interpretation, which is basically the oral rendering of a message from the source language to the target language in real time as the speaker speaks. And simultaneous interpretation can be unidirectional. So it's when you are interpreting only to the non-dominant language. And then, so for example, you're interpreting from English to Spanish. And then when there's an intervention into Spanish, you interpret it in a consecutive mode into English when needed. So most of the dialogue, most of the language that is spoken is English. Bidirectional simultaneous interpreting is when you're interpreting in both the non-dominant and language, dominant and non-dominant languages with everybody wearing headsets. So probably you have seen this. This is usually, you know, people think about the UN, where people who do not understand all the languages that will be present in a space would use interpretation equipment so they can hear all the different interventions. And often when we are in space that is mostly spoken in English, we have the experience of only those people who don't speak English use the headsets. In the language justice framework, we always want to move people towards using bidirectional simultaneous interpretation. It could be marginalizing still for people, even though interpretation is provided, people who want to participate in spaces that are mostly facilitated in English, when they want to raise their hand and share an experience in Spanish, they feel uncomfortable because they feel that the whole session has to pause so they can do a consecutive interpretation. And it really doesn't allow for that full ability to participate and bring their full identities and their full selves to the room. So in a language justice context, it's always suggested to have bidirectional, and then everybody who doesn't speak the languages that are present in that room, everybody who's not bilingual or trilingual, would then use interpretation equipment, and there's a better flow of communication among the people who are present. Consecutive interpretation, so again, simultaneous is mostly for conferences or the UN, trainings, and more is being used in the court settings where the interpreter is using equipment and the defendant or the petitioner is also using equipment, so it's more effective and it takes less time. Consecutive is the oral rendering of a message in the language into another language after the speaker has completed a statement or question. So it's mostly in service provision, and probably many of you have engaged in consecutive interpretation. And side translation is a rendering of material that is written in one language, and then you speak it in another language in a way of that you're interpreting it. So for example, there's an affidavit that has been written in Spanish, and then the interpreter does side translation and then renders that affidavit into English.
Sure.
And in sign language, similar, they're also used consecutive and simultaneous. But in sign language interpreting, the process of transmitting spoken language into sign language and or gestures and vice versa to communicate with deaf and hard of hearing people. Again, there are sign languages in many different places of the world. And so when you're working with a client, you want to make sure that you understand and not assume that they speak ASL, American Sign Language, and they might even not understand or have learned the sign language that is official to the region of the world where they are coming from. So many people who live in rural areas, they don't learn how to sign, and they use often, for example, transliteration, which is the transmitting spoken language into one of several English-oriented varieties of manual communications between deaf and hard of hearing. So ASL has its own syntax, its own language, which is not similar to English, and when you're transliterating, you use similar forms than English to communicate with gestures or signs. There is a website that I included there. You can click when you have time, and it's a great video that shows you the difference between interpreting and transliteration. Relay interpreting is when you have more than one language, and for example, here the example shows us having maybe a deaf Japanese client who uses Japanese Sign Language, and then you have an interpreter who's going to be interpreting for Japanese Sign Language into Japanese, and then So that person will relay the interpreter from JSL to Japanese, and you have a Japanese interpreter who will be interpreting into English and rendering the Japanese interpretation into English interpretation so that the English-speaking attorney can understand what the deaf Japanese client is saying. This applies to also many languages that are of lesser diffusion, as we call them. So, for example, if you're working with indigenous communities of different countries, there might be fewer interpreters who are actually trilingual. So you will mostly find interpreters who have a language combination, for example, Mixteco Spanish, and then you will have an interpreter who interprets Mixteco to Spanish, and then another one Spanish to English, and then you can render the message. It's very important that you're aware that summarization is not interpretation, and this is often what is used by bilingual staff who do not have training on interpreting skills and ethical considerations. The risk of summarization is that people are actually editing the information that is being rendered, and the interpretation is not accurate and complete. So it's very, very important to know this, and it's not allowed in any setting, in medical or legal, because it really leaves out crucial information in interviews or interrogations, and it is important that you're taking away agency from the person who's speaking. You're taking away really their ability to convey fully their story when you are summarizing. And when we're thinking about interpretation, especially when we're thinking about simultaneous interpretation, there's this moment of, I like to call the magic of interpretation, when it's like an aha moment where you can speak, and through the interpreter, you are communicating with somebody from a very different community with very different backgrounds, and find points of common, find similar struggles. And this can be done through working with interpreters. So as I mentioned, interpretation is context specific. So you have interpretation in the UN, which is used in many different languages. You have interpretation in the settings that you might be more familiar, in counseling or interviews or in court. You have interpretation that is needed for outreach meetings or workshops. You have interpretation that is done with deaf and hard of hearing communities, and there's also remote and video interpreting. What's important in all of these settings is that you understand that the language that is used in a domestic violence and sexual assault context and the guidelines that need to be used in this settings are different, and you really need to, as an advocate, we have most of you being advocates, really need to look at how interpretation is supporting the victim. So you want to, through the interpretation and this language support, you want to make sure that the victim is safe and empowered. So you always want to make sure that you're working with the victims and prepare them to work with interpreters. So introduce them to the interpreters. Explain the process. How is this going to work? This person might have never worked with interpreters. What are the roles? What are the expectations? Confidentiality is a really big thing that you really need to cover when you're working with interpreters. You have to really make sure that you explain both sides, that confidentiality has to be kept, especially for the victim. It's really challenging when we're working with languages of lesser diffusion and smaller communities, because sometimes the person who's able to interpret, whether they're trained or not, might know the victim or might know someone who knows the victim. So really make sure that you're aware of those conflicts of interest when you're hiring interpreters. Positioning is very important. You want to make sure that the interpreter is positioned in a place where the victim feels safe. Sometimes victims prefer being able to be seated close to a door, or where they can have, visual to the door in case they feel that need to go out. And making sure that you always let the client know that they have the ability to let you know that they don't understand the interpreter, or that the interpreter is not working. Often they don't feel empowered to do that. So you really need to highlight and emphasize that if they feel that the interpreter is not doing a great job, they have to let you know. Make sure that you always provide a choice. So they might prefer, and most of people prefer in-person interpretation. This is challenging, of course, because of budget constraints, but give them the option if you have the ability to provide in-person interpretation. Making sure that you give them the option to work with a female or a male interpreter. And again, as I said, making sure that they know that they can change interpreter if they don't feel comfortable with the one provided at first. You have to make sure that everything that is being said is being interpreted, and that's what we mean by communicative autonomy. So every decision that is made by the interpreter impacts the case of the victim. So decisions in terms of language use or what information is being interpreted, in what way is being interpreted, is actually impacting the case of the client. And just really trying to work and find interpreters that are trauma informed, and we're going to be talking about this in a little bit, but making sure that the interpreter is has knowledge in how to work with clients that have experienced trauma and that themselves have not, experienced or not experienced vicarious trauma. A lot of interpreters, and we're going to be covering this in a little bit, a lot of interpreters often don't feel comfortable interpreting trauma because of the triggering that might cause. So let's go to the next slide. So which statement is true? And this is a quiz, a poll. So being fluent in 2 languages qualifies a person to be an interpreter. B, both limited English proficient and sign language interpreters must follow codes of ethics. And C, all interpreters can summarize.
So yeah, she's
so if you can please respond in the chat box.
Sometimes.
A, B, or C.
She's gonna label. Oh, the chat box.
Okay, so we have B's. We have an A. Let's see. We have the large majority are B's and 1 A.
Great, thank you so much, Agatha. So absolutely, B is the correct answer. Both limited English proficient and sign language interpreters must follow codes of ethic. Being fluent in 2 languages allows somebody to be an interpreter, but does not qualify them as an interpreter. And let's get into that. So really, being bilingual is not enough. So bilingualism is a start point for most translators and interpreters, but it's not a skill in itself. Really, being an interpreter requires all of these incredible skills that you're looking at here. It really requires different cognitive skills. It requires full fluency in both languages, in the source and target language, and it really requires training. It's important to have a combination of subject area expertise, reading skills, and excellent writing in the target language. Specifically, this is for translators. And often what happens in organizations is that they think that because somebody is bilingual, they can just hop on a conversation and interpret that. And that's not the reality. So it's very important that you're aware of what are the skills that are required and the different settings. So for example, we have here 4 of the main settings in which interpretation is provided. So for medical and legal interpretation, there's very specialized vocabulary. There's very specialized training and a certification process. It's mostly done one-on-one and consecutive. And there is liability for those interpreters that don't provide an accurate and complete interpretation. In conference, it's a little bit more flexible. It's mostly simultaneous, as I mentioned before. And there's opportunity to prepare for most of them. But really, you want to make sure that you understand the different contexts in which interpretation is provided and in which interpreters are trained for, and make sure that you ask or you hire the best interpreter for the context that you're working with. And ad hoc community interpretation is usually more flexible. This is, a space where you can start training bilingual staff to improve their skills as interpreters when there's an emergency and there's a need. And it's important to understand the role of the interpreter, right? So the interpreter's role is to facilitate communication between two or more people who use different languages, whether spoken or signed. And this is very, very important. This is the main goal, to place all participants on an equal footing as much as possible. And their job is to render everything. So when one person is not trained, they're just bilingual, they're not trained as interpreters, and they're being put in the difficult situation of having to interpret, for example, a medical appointment, they will not have the terminology that it requires to do an excellent job. They will probably summarize, they will probably edit information, they will probably feel uncomfortable with some of the terms, and then they will be omitting, adding, embellishing, or just not rendering the message that is spoken. This is a list, a very useful list for you to consider. What are some of the skills, qualifications, and specializations that you want to look for when you're looking for interpreters? So interpreters most have proficiency, as I mentioned, in the source and target language. They can use any of the modes of interpretation that we covered before, because in different settings, you might have to use different modes of interpretation. They have to know the vocabulary that's context specific. They have to know slang. For example, there's people in your community that might not feel comfortable using some body parts names, and they use slang for it. So the interpreter has to be able to render that from slang into the same level, the register into the target language. They have to understand idiomatic expressions and regional variations. And this is a reality for many victims, that sometimes they are provided an interpreter. For example, if somebody who speaks Cantonese, they're giving an interpreter who's interpreter in Mandarin, and there are differences in the variations in the language. Or as simple as somebody who might speak Spanish from Mexico or from Puerto Rico, the vocabulary is different, the expressions are different, and then it will not be a good match. Make sure that they speak with a proper pronunciation and intonation. And specifically, very, very important to follow interpreter ethical standards. So a lot of the people who are used as interpreters who are not trained as interpreters, they do not know ethical considerations. So this is something very important that you have to look into, whether the person that you're working with has had exposure and knowledge about the ethical considerations of being an interpreter. You might want to look also at the different certifications. These are the bodies that provide certification. I encourage you looking online to understand better what does it entail to become an interpreter in the judicial and medical setting.
You could hear the bugs cry.
And this, this is a whole webinar on its own, a whole training on its own, the codes of ethics and professional conduct for interpreters.
We talked a little bit.
This list was taken from canons of ethical considerations for many different local states. But these are the main points that you want to make sure that the interpreter that you're working with understands. So they have to be accurate and complete.
I was like, okay.
Are they qualified? Are they certified?
She was okay.
You have to really make sure that you know what are their qualifications. Making sure that there's no conflict of interest. So for example, if the interpreter knows the person, the victim, or goes to school with the cousin, there might be a conflict of interest, again, especially with those languages that are of lesser diffusion. But they can behave professionally. They understand confidentiality. They cannot comment while they're interpreting. There's a lot of interpreters who feel comfortable and empowered to make comments about what's being interpreted, or to talk about the meeting or the session that they interpreted in public. That's a violation of the code of ethics. They have to understand their scope of practice. So if you have a medical interpreter, somebody who's specialized and trained in medical interpreting, they have to understand what their scope of practice is and be aware that they should not be interpreting legal conversations or in legal settings. Making sure that you know how to assess and report. So always when you're working with an interpreter and you know, based on what the client is telling you, that the interpreter is not interpreting accurately, always making sure that you know how to assess and report them. And this can be done in any context, including the judicial context or the medical context. And Making sure interpreters who are certified have to do some professional development, continued education, make sure that the person that you're working with has achieved that. So assessing interpretation skills and qualifications. These are a set of questions that you might want to ask yourself or ask the interpreters. So first of all, what is the context in which you need interpretation? If you need interpretation for a meeting, it's going to be a very different skill set that you might want to look at in case you need interpretation for an interview, a legal interview, or an intake. Is the interpreter certified or registered? So based on the jurisdiction in which you are, there's certain languages that are certified by the court. So for which there is a certification process that includes a written and oral exam, and where they have to present their skills and show their knowledge and fluency, and then ultimately they get certified. They can be decertified if they fall into one of these violations of ethics, or they might be registered. So for registered interpreters, also there's different considerations based on the jurisdiction. I recommend that you check online in your court, your local court system. Registered interpreters usually for interpreters of not so common languages as certified languages, but there is still a process to make sure that they are complying and that they have certain skills necessary to render and to work as interpreters. And if you need to work with interpreters who don't have a certification, well, you want to identify the skill level, and Wendy talked a little bit about that during the last session. You might have, if there's somebody who says, well, I can interpret this conversation, you might want to have someone who's bilingual in your organization to assess their level of fluency. You can use different glossaries and dictionaries to test them in different terminology or jargon. And also maybe you can use articles and text if you're trying to test the ability, for example, to translate, or you can pay for a professional assessment.
Yeah. Yes, I said, because they're trying to.
So I'm going to pause here for a second, Agueda, and check if people have any questions at this point. I know that it's a lot of information, and you can always email us at the end, but I just wanted to pause for a second and see if somebody has any questions.
Right now, I don't see any questions that have been shared here in the question box. So I don't know if people is writing any questions that they have. I will let you know if that comes up.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much. Okay, so let's do a quick quiz. So please respond on the chat box whether this is true or false. Using a friend or accompanying family member to interpret is a safe practice. So please write down in the chat box whether you think this is true or false.
False, false, no, false, false, false.
Right.
False. Continue being false. All of them are false.
Absolutely, perfect. Thank you so much, Agueda. So absolutely false. So never, ever, ever using a friend or an accompanying family member to interpret. And this has been a practice that has been taking a long time to remedy. Traditionally, for many, many years, children from the age of 5 would be interpreting a medical appointment or interviews with police or law enforcement, or they would have the brother-in-law interpreting also a medical appointment or domestic violence related appointments. You should never use family members, as you know, or children, unless, of course, there is immediate danger or serious physical harm of life. That's the only really situation where there's really, it's life and death. You cannot communicate in a life-threatening situation, but that's the only exigent circumstance, and it has to be avoided mostly in most circumstances at all costs. Who else should not interpret in domestic violence and sexual assault settings? And here you have a pretty expansive list. So you really want to make sure that you don't have any of these professionals interpreting for your clients. And some of them might have the skill of being bilingual. Again, being bilingual is not enough. You want to make sure that people that are interpreting with your clients are trained in the different modes of interpreting, are trained in ethical considerations, and they are not playing a dual role. And this is often what happens, apologies, with the organizations that have limited resources.
He always said that
Bilingual staff are having roles of both staff and interpreter. And that creates a lot of confusion for the client. It doesn't really show the boundaries of when are you my interpreter, when are you my advocate, and it really taints the ability of being neutral in terms of the ethical canons of ethics and considerations for interpreters. You cannot be neutral if you are also playing the role of an advocate. And this is just some differences between bilingual staff versus an interpreter. So as I said, bilingual staff, you're fluent in English and you're in your native language. You are not a conduit or a neutral party. You are an advocate. So you are being impartial. And there's really no government standard, but there's a recommendation of assessing bilingual staff when they're going to be working bilingually with clients. An interpreter has the ability to speak and render a message from one language to another. They go through very in-depth, comprehensive training. They are and should be a neutral party. They have fluency in both languages. They're not only knowledgeable in both languages, but they have full fluency in both languages, and they are a conduit to communicate. So you really want to make sure that you're working with interpreters to communicate with your clients. I know that many of you will say, well, we don't have the resources, or we haven't planned for that. This is where the language access planning comes in. And again, for those who had not been connected to the webinar as early as I made this announcement, I want everybody to know that we can provide support in developing language access plans, and also thinking through how can you work with bilingual staff, and how can you perhaps develop a pool of community interpreters. And there's many organizations who have done that through training, and we're happy to respond to any questions that you might have about that. These are some questions that you want to consider when working with bilingual staff as interpreters. Are they fluent in both languages? It's very similar to the questions that I shared before when you're assessing an interpreter, but really focusing on the fact of whether or not can they avoid conflict of interest when working with a client, and if they can stay in the interpreter's role or not, and avoid functioning in the advocate's role. Whether the client, the judge, the attorney, or the case manager will be confused by the different roles that you're playing. And could you be a potential witness in the case? It's very important that when bilingual advocates are sometimes playing this dual role and they're providing interpretation, the client attorney privilege is lost. So interpreters are protected by client attorney privilege because they are a conduit to communicate between both. Once there is a bilingual staff whose role is not clear, they can potentially be called and subpoenaed as witnesses in the case. So you have to also make sure that you understand that and your organization understands that, so you don't put your client's case at risk. And whether your safety will be jeopardized if you play these roles, and basically really making sure that your participation as interpreter while being a bilingual staff or bilingual advocate is not impacting negatively the case of the victim. These are, so I know that probably there's a lot of questions around this, and I'm going to keep going just in the interest of time. If there's any questions, we'll have time at the end to respond those questions. Maybe if people are thinking about it and the questions will come up later on. This is just some questions that you can use just in general when you're working with interpreters to spot a bad interpreter. So whether you are working with a staff that has not been trained or a trained interpreter, but you are suspecting that the interpretation is not correct, these are some of the questions that you want to ask yourself. Are you understanding the interpreter? Do they look confused? So sometimes the interpreter will just interpret very few words. In some languages, the interpretation is not exactly the same length as the source language. That's a reality. But also you can realize by facial gestures whether the interpreter or the client look confused. Is the interpreter engaging in side conversations? So interpreters have to always interpret everything that is being said, and that's also some protocols that attorneys and advocates have to know. And interpreters should not be engaging in side conversations with the client or with anyone else. Is the interpreter summarizing? Is everything being interpreted, or is there a change in your client's demeanor? So you can see if the client comes in with you and the interview starts, they're very attentive and they are helping to provide more information into the case. And as the interpretation goes along, if you see a change in the meaning of the client, it might mean that the interpreter is not doing a great job. And then you can pause the conversation and maybe perhaps using a bilingual staff to ask the question whether the interpretation is going well or not. Or you can eventually call a language line, have a conversation interpreted with a client to figure out if the in-person interpreter is working or not. So I would like to move towards how can we plan for interpretation. So we went through the basics. We have already talked about the different modes of interpretation and different things to consider when you are interpreting. And I want to start thinking about how can we plan for interpretation. And interpretation will be present or needed in different contexts. So events and services. So I have a scenario here that yes.
We do have a question before you move up to the scenario and the other question, that what happened if actually your family member works as an interpreter?
Yes, you should never have a family member as an interpreter. You cannot have, especially for, I don't know the specific context, but if a client is coming with a family member to interpret, you should always avoid using that person as interpreter and offer an in-person interpreter or a language line. And this is where the whole planning for language access comes in place. So everybody who's in this call should know what the protocols are in your organization to access to interpreters. So never, as I mentioned, unless it's an exigent circumstance where it's really life-threatening, life or death. But even though in those circumstances, the best option is really always try to look for trained interpreters because there is a lot of issues that might arise from working with family or family members, friends, or children. So it's not a best practice. Does that respond to the question?
Yes, it says, okay, understood. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Perfect. So I wanted to give you this scenario. So imagine, and this might be, it might resonate for many of you. So you're holding an outreach event and you want the community to learn about the services that you provide and the programs that you offer. A lot of people have confirmed their participation. There are a few English speakers that have been registered in the event and several people who prefer communicating in Spanish, Korean, and Hindi. So I will ask you to please chat away. What strategies would you use to plan for this outreach event? So what would be the things that you would do to plan for this event? Let's say that this event will happen in December 15th of this year. What will you do to plan for this event? And I'll give a couple of,
Different interpreters.
1 minute to respond.
We have one answer. It says, we'll locate interpreters that speak those languages. We'll reach out to the community. Have 3 different interpreters available with headsets for each one.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, great.
And I'm waiting to see if anybody else is going to share. But at this point, it has stopped. Translate
Perfect.
materials in each language.
Translate material in each language. Perfect. Absolutely. Great. So you're all experts in creating multilingual spaces, it seems. So absolutely. So first of all,
sorry, last one I just come says, make sure material is available in language of preferred for offer use if needed.
Absolutely. Great. Thank you so much, Akeba. So absolutely, you're absolutely right. So when you're planning an event like this, outreach event, a training, you want to, first of all, understand what type of event you're creating. So will this event mostly facilitated in English and interpreted into dominant, non-dominant languages, or are you planning for a multilingual event? And there's different considerations in each case. So as somebody mentioned, if you are creating a multilingual event, you want to make sure that everybody is using, who doesn't speak those 3 languages, is using interpretation equipment. So that will have implications in your budget, and it will have implications in the tools that you can use during the training or the event. You, of course, want to create a space where everybody has the ability to communicate fully and participate fully in the event, and most of the times is really creating multilingual, bilingual events where everybody, including facilitators and presenters, use interpretation equipment. And what's important is when you're thinking about what event you're planning is really thinking about who is presenting at your event. So we often default to presenters who speak English, but also being aware that you have the ability to invite community members or experts in the field who might be more comfortable speaking different languages, and you can interpret from the front of the room. So you can have a Hindi speaker or a Spanish speaker, and then have the interpreter interpret it into the different languages that are present in the room, including English, and in this case, all the other languages that we mentioned. So this brings us to what languages will be present, and somebody mentioned outreach. So really learning in advance what languages will be present. We already know here what languages will be present because we did a RSVP. And we probably have to translate the RSVP in different languages because we heard from Spanish, Korean, and Hindi speakers as well as English speakers. So making sure that from the beginning you plan in advance your outreach material to be translated in the target languages that you're thinking about. And when you are thinking about the services that you provide, you always want to think about not only the people that traditionally come to you, but the people that traditionally, by your geographical area are eligible to participate. And her partner. What is the structure of the event? So you want to think about the different moments of your event and how many interpreters will you need for each segment. So you have to plan to hire at least 2 interpreters per language combination. So here we have 3 language combinations, so 2 interpreters per language combination. And interpreters usually work with a partner, and they take breaks every 30 minutes. So there's something that's called interpreter fatigue that is real, and after 30 minutes there is a decrease in ability to be accurate and complete in the interpretation. Making sure that you prepare the interpreters and speakers before time, so letting the interpreters know what topics will be covered. So often, as I mentioned, interpreters will feel uncomfortable interpreting trauma, and they might choose not to interpret at your event. So letting interpreters know what the topic of the event will be, and making sure that you provide all the information that is needed for them to prepare. So a copy of the agenda, PowerPoint, any handouts that will be used during the event. And again, as somebody mentioned, making sure that all of those materials are translated into the different languages. Often what happens is that we have interpreters, but then there's handouts or there's activities that are only available in one specific language. And then the rest of the people who speak the other languages do not have the opportunity or the ability to participate fully because they cannot read or they just cannot follow the prompts of the activity. And letting the speakers and facilitators know that this will be interpreted and prepare them to make sure that they speak slowly. As you mentioned, there are certain practices where interpreters ask to slow down, to speak louder, and making sure that everybody is participating in the creation of the bilingual or multilingual space. The creation of bilingual spaces are really the responsibility of everyone, not only the interpreters. It's everybody who should be interested in having an effective flow of communication.
Yes.
And making sure, as we mentioned again, to have everything available. There might be people when you do your registration that might want braille. So making sure to account for the time and resources that you need to translate all of that. So these are some strategies that I would let you read afterwards. Is what I already mentioned, making sure that you're working with your interpreters, you're supporting your interpreters as well, giving them breaks, and hiring always 2 interpreters at least if the event will be more than 1 hour.
Continue.
So here I have a second scenario, and I will read it out loud. Personally, I'm going to have to go directly to the strategies. So you have a woman who's a victim of domestic violence coming to your office. She speaks some English, but her first language is Farsi. You do not have anyone on your staff who speaks Farsi, nor have worked with a Farsi interpreter in the past. She shows you a document that indicates that she has a hearing in 3 days. To extend her protective order, you need to conduct an intake client interview and prepare her for her hearing in 3 days. So I might give like half a second if somebody has something in mind of what strategy would you use to plan. I'm sorry, it says outreach event. It should be to provide services to this victim. So I will give just like half a minute if somebody has any burning ideas on strategies. Is anything coming up, Aida?
It says, use the language line to communicate with her and provide what she needs.
Absolutely. So this really goes back again, as I mentioned, to your language access plan and the protocols that you have established in your organization. If you don't know them, go ask today. Go talk to your supervisor and ask what those language access protocols are. And if there is no in place, please send an email and we can support you in developing that. So again, assessing your local population that's eligible to seek services at your agency. You want to develop contract agreements with interpreting agencies, which includes language lines, to support you in providing the interpretation, and follow the guidelines that we already mentioned, to prepare interpreters for specific appointments or procedures. So you want to make sure if it's online, if it's remote, a language line, or in person, to provide the interpreter all the information that is necessary for them to have the context of the session that you're having. And when you are engaging interpreting agencies, it's very important to work with specifically cultural sensitive programs in your area. They might already have good ideas of agencies that might give you a sense of what the best options are around. Understand the services they provide and the values that they stand for. Some agencies don't work with domestic violence survivors. They mostly do corporate work. So making sure that you understand the work and the experience that they have, and building relationship with these interpreting agencies. It takes time, but we really encourage you to work in partnerships with organizations that provide culture-specific services and with these different interpreting agencies. Here is a list, and yes.
We also had two more suggestions or answers to your question. Is that one was using the language line again. We also had Google Translate to Farsi or language line.
Okay, thank you so much for that, Agueda. And I would encourage you to look at the recording of our session last week. Google Translate is really not an option. I would discourage you very emphatically to not use Google Translate. Google Translate is a robot. It doesn't really understand the context. And it has been shown in many different circumstances that the translation is not accurate. So I would really discourage, I mean, unless there's like an emergency again, but Google Translate is not the way to go for translations, and also not the way to interpret. Interpretation, as I mentioned before, interpretation and translation require important level of skill development. That's why interpreters and translators are certified, and Google Translate can really distort the message or the information. So make sure that you have that in mind. Here's a list of questions that you can ask to interpretation agencies. I'm not going to go over them, but basically what you want to understand is what experience do they have? Do they have certified interpreters in the legal or medical context? Have they received any trauma-informed training? What are their fees? Do they provide remote interpreting? Do they work with certified deaf interpreters? And what is their cancellation policy? So really making sure that you understand their skills, their background, the history in service provision, and understand also the terms of the agreement. What are the rates? Do they provide services online, so video remote, or if they have specialty interpreting services. This is a video that I also would like you to look at when you have a chance, when you receive this PowerPoint presentation. This is a great video, very interactive, that shows you how to work with interpreters. This was developed by the Legal Services New Jersey and is a great resource to use with your staff to train them on how to work with interpreters if you want to share information that we went through today. We covered this last time, and again, the recording of the last session is available. You can email Agatha to request that. But I just wanted to highlight that when you're planning for interpretation, you really need to look at the budget considerations. So interpretation is an investment that is very well worth. It's a legal mandate for those who are receiving federal funding to provide services to victims and clients, and it's an investment when you are thinking about doing workshops. And even though you're not receiving federal funding, there's many different opportunities, grants that you can apply to, and this is the cost, estimated cost, that you want to look at for sign or spoken language interpretation, the interpretation equipment, and translation. So different rates for different activities, and there's specifics for when you're working with interpreters. So some interpreters might charge more based on their experience, or based on their specialty. Some translators might charge more based on the deadline that you provide them, the length, the technicality of the language. They're translators, and I'm going to go over working with translators right now. But it's very important that you understand that translators also have specialty in working from one language to the other. So there's very few translators, for example, that can work from Spanish to English and English in Spanish. They are also most of the time certified in just one direction. This is also a great resource on how to work with interpreters over the phone. It's very important that you
need to wash your hands.
Follow certain protocols that include understanding, receiving the identification of the interpreter that you're working with. Make sure that everybody has access to a telephone service, that the connection is adequate, that there's no noise behind. Sometimes there's a lot of noise in the background and it's really hard to understand what is being said. Making sure that the client is in a place that she feels comfortable, where nobody else can hear the conversation, and making sure that if the interpretation is not working, you have a system to record incidents and complain with the agency when you have somebody that's not really doing the work that they should be doing when interpreting for your client.
this as well.
So if you click on the link, you will have that visual there, that it's a great guideline, step by step before you start, when you're placing the call, and then through the call and after the call.
Officers for coming. Go. Yes.
So these are general considerations for working with interpreters, making sure that you always prepare your interpreters, as we mentioned, the position, where to place yourself and where the interpreter should place themselves, looking directly to the limited English proficient person or the best person. There's people who talk to the interpreter. That's not a best practice. You want to talk directly to build rapport with the person, and use first language. So never use ask her, tell her, but engaging directly with the person. And as people started this webinar with, always making sure that you are aware that interpretation is present and speaking naturally and at a reasonable pace.
Just never mind.
We covered translation last time, but I just wanted to highlight that as a grantee, you need to provide translation of vital documents. Sorry, I moved it too fast. And just, can you please give me a couple of examples of what are vital documents in the chat box?
Okay, we're giving a couple minutes just for people. Intakes is one of them. Release of information is another one.
Yes.
Brochures, restraining forms. Let's see what else is shared with us today.
Absolutely. So,
victim impact statements.
Absolutely. So it's those documents that need to be translated in order to be able to provide services to victims, to make sure that they have access to the services. So it's basically documents that affect the access, retention, or termination of program, service, provision, or benefit. So Wendy went very in-depth last time talking about what those vital documents are. But as you mentioned, letters of notices, rights, list of rights, important health related documents, intake forms, et cetera, complaint forms, et cetera, et cetera. And just to cover very quickly and leave a couple of minutes for questions, when we're working with translators, it's very similar to interpretation. So in this case, and I'm just going to read it out loud, Juliet is bilingual and she recently joined your agency. You need to translate the affidavit of a Korean-speaking client, and your peer mentions that Juliet is bilingual in English and Korean, and that she should be able to help you with that. Would you let Juliet translate the application, yes or no?
Brain it, how do we make this happen? Because everything was just go, 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 go.
See, now you can kind of do the call to action. You can kind of write that, and you can be
the chat
for them. That if they have questions, and they don't know, they can contact you and say like, that will be TA. That's what you're being paid for. Like, yes, it is fantastic. It's like they need to remember that you're not gone. Right?
I don't know if something has come up, Agatha.
Yes. We have a yes, a no, but have her review once complete.
Okay. So again, it's very important. Yes, no, have her review.
All the time, so they keep coming. Sorry.
Great. So in the case, it says that she recently joined your agency, so we don't have any knowledge about what's her prior experience. So she might not be very well vested in the terminology used in your agency. So I would really refrain from having her translate the affidavit. And even reviewing it, it doesn't seem that she might have the skill at this time to be able to do that. You always, similar to with interpreters, you want to make sure that you work with certified translators. And this is also a great graphic that gives you a sense of what does it mean to be a certified linguist, and includes what are some of the things that you want to look into translators.
population.
So you have to be able to write well in their native language.
Like
They have to have enough fluency in English and understand the English text. They have to be familiar with the culture and language patterns of the intended readers. They have to have experience in translating materials that are similar to yours. So for example, in this case, it doesn't seem that Julian has a lot of experience translating affidavits. We don't know, so it's context specific. And it's helpful that they are familiar with the subject matter of your material. So if you have somebody who's bilingual, who has worked in your agency for a while, you can potentially use them to review, especially if you're doing outreach material, and make sure that the language is adequate for your material. For an affidavit, I would perhaps leave it for a certified translator. Are there any additional questions? At this point, we have about 5 more minutes.
So at this moment, I don't see any questions, but maybe if you keep talking and they come up, I will start reading them and let you know.
Great.
Actually, we have one, right?
So, and it could be any question related to the presentation in general. It's a lot of material. And again, we're more than happy to respond to emails. If you're a grantee, OVW grantee, we very possibly can provide you with technical assistance and training. So feel free to send us an email with any questions.
So we have one question, Ana Paula. It says, how can we obtain language line information cards?
So there is a lot of I Speak cards online. I don't know what service you're using, so you might want to get in touch with the specific service that you're using. There's also different I Speak cards that we can send you. If you send me an email, I can follow up with you. And my information is at the end of this presentation. Here's a list of many different resources that I recommend that you take a look at. Many of those have been developed by the Asian Pacific Institute on considerations on when working with interpreters. And if you have questions regarding working with deaf and hard of hearing, the Vera Institute is a great resource. They are also TA providers, and they focus all of their work on accessibility and working with the deaf and hard of hearing. And here's my email, anogues@apigbv. Aguila, can you please just let me know, send me an email of the person who had the question about the cards, so we can follow up afterwards.
Absolutely. If there's any questions or anything that we hear from the people who participate in this webinar, we will make sure that you and Wendy get all those questions. At this time, it feels like that was the one question that came up. I don't have any other questions right now. Oh, great. Take it back. Is there any specific institute to train interpreters in the legal settings?
Yes, so there's many different institutes, and I can provide you a list over if you send me an email as well. There are different schools, and you can have, based on your jurisdiction, sometimes the local courts have a list of different schools that provide trainings on legal interpreting. So that's an option. You might want to take a look at the National Center for State Courts. They have a lot of information about training for legal interpreting. You also might want to take a look at the National Association of Judiciary Interpreters and Translators, NAJIT, N-A-J-I-T. And I can also send those resources over email. So before we close, I just wanted to share this quote. Language is personal, visceral, and powerful, and it's tied to our lands and to our bodies. Every time we open our mouths to speak in our accents and dialogues, we identify ourselves and bring all these things with us. When we come together, to have the hard conversations, it is important that we're able to express ourselves in the language that most fully conveys the depth and nuances of our hopes and our frustrations. So I hope this training was illuminating for you, made you think about what strategies you can use with interpreters and translators. And again, thank you so much for your time. And we are very happy to continue the conversation with you after this training via email.
Thank you, Ana Paula. We have 2 emails that we will send to you from 2 different participants who wrote it down on our question box. We will send that information to you. And then we have thank you from other participants. At this time, we are at the end of our webinar. We would like to thank Ana Paula for all the amazing information that you shared with us. It was really, really important and really informative. I would also like to say that please fill out the I'm sorry, I'm kind of struggling trying to read what is there in the board and whether sharing in the question box. So I would like to ask you to please fill out our questionnaire at the end of this webinar, and we will be sending an email with all this PowerPoint information. Again, thank you so much for attending this webinar. Next month, we are going to be having a webinar that is going to be talking about working with the religious entities in your community and to best provide services for survivors of sexual violence who are the main community is related to a religion. So I will strongly suggest that you look forward for that webinar, and hopefully we'll be able to see you then. Thank you again for participating. Thank you, Ana Paula. You all have a fantastic
Thank you so much.
Afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.